Facebook, it's Coach Rick, and it's now winter time, or it's starting the fall winter season, and it is cold. This morning it was about 30 to 40 degrees in Bartlett, that's right outside Chicago, and it's probably going to be hitting spikes every once in a while until deep in November, when it's going to be 30 to 40 every day. Sunshine or cloud cover, it doesn't matter, but when the temperature drops, a lot of people start to have problems with arthritis or arthritis type pain. I have had some patients with rheumatoid and or osteoarthritis, two different things, but rheumatoid is because of rheumatologic disorder. Osteo is usually because of wear and tear and age or injury. So if check out my videos on YouTube as far as turmeric, fibromyalgia. I think I have one on arthritis. However, I'm going to try to explain what happens with regards to pain. So that's my tea that warms me up. So first off, this is a joint. It's an elbow joint in particular. The elbow joint is a classic example of what happens with what a joint looks like. I mean, you can talk about fingers, but it would be too small to draw, or hips, too complicated. So I just drew the elbow. So if you look at this thing, you've got a humerus over here. That's the shoulder to the elbow. Then you have a forearm over here. There's two bones here, there's one bone here. This is the radius and ulna. So that's what makes up the bones that connect in the middle. The in the middle part is the elbow joint. And the way it works is that the elbow has, it's a junction between two surfaces that are supposed to rub on each other for 70 to 100 years. Now, obviously, if two surfaces that are made of bone, which if you've ever seen bone under a microscope, it's almost like coral. And you would think, well, coral, microscopically, if you rub one piece of coral to another piece of coral, it should grind itself down. And that's not what you want. That's osteoarthritis. So the human body has this protective capsule. I don't know if you could see that. It's in purple. Oh, I just lost the light. Anyway, this where the humerus meets the olecranon, or the ulna, is the surface of two cartilage. There's cartilage on the surface, and cartilage is soft, kind of like the end of a chicken breast. And cartilage is supposed to help with cushioning, like in the knee, so you can take impact. But it's also meant to give a viscous, with a drop of fluid. That cartilage is very slippery, and it will go potentially for 70 to 80 years, 90 to 100. I think I said 100. However, the problem is that you have to have a drop of fluid always there. So you have this purple cover. It encapsulates the two surfaces together, and it keeps fluid. It's called synovial. It's called a synovium. And it keeps the fluid, or the drops of fluid, not uric acid, but hyaluronic acid, in the surface to touch both surfaces, cartilage, so that it stays moist and lubricated and slippery viscosity for life. So that's how it works. And then there's muscles like the bicep and tricep that go over the joint to stimulate movement like a hinge. So that's essentially what happens with a joint. Now, when you have that joint, I'm just going to talk about the olecranon, or the elbow. When you have that joint irritated during cold weather or a winter season, it could be for a number of things. And I put three of what I think are the most popular things. The first one would be, why do you have stiff joints? Because your muscles are tighter. If you have tight muscles like this bicep going from the humerus and attaching to the forearm, it's supposed to do that. It's supposed to cross, the muscles are supposed to cross the joint so that when the muscles contract, the joint flexes. So tight muscles in cold weather can cause more impact or more friction to the joint because the muscles are tighter, so it actually pulls the two bones in a higher pressure, in a tighter configuration, so that rubbing together will be a little bit will be added. You'll have added friction to those two surfaces, so that can give you the subjective feeling of aches and pains. So a tight joint usually means higher friction. Decreased blood flow could also be there in the muscle when you're cold, especially when I take hikers out to 30 to 40 degrees and then there's wind blowing, the surface skin is very cold, but the muscle can also be cold. Cold muscle needs to be moved to get blood flow to the muscle, or else you get cramped and you just have the shivering feeling. And shivering is an act that the muscle does in contracting to cause more blood flow to the muscle. So the shivering effect is a remedy for tight muscles and less blood flow. So more blood flow in theory, I'll take these one at a time, more blood flow in theory will take care of the tight muscles. So I put the rescue here. I put down, the option would be warmer clothes, maybe a warmer bath, a warmer house, maybe a heating pad applied to the outside of the joint, or some form of heating element. A topical, I put a question mark on, because topical like menthol or capsaicin, it doesn't really heat the joint up. It doesn't really provide thermal heat. It actually provides a sensation that it's hot, like peppers. So you're kind of fooling the joint or the brain into thinking it's hot, when in actuality it's not really changing the viscosity, if we're going to deal with that. I also put down stretching or yoga. Now, you don't have to be a yoga practitioner, but I think pre-activity stretching will get the muscle to extend a little bit. So technically, instead of the joint coming down hard, one bone on top of another because the muscles are tight, the loosened muscle will allow a little bit of less pressure to the joint, so it's easier to move. So that's my first theory. And these are just theories. And I know a lot of people like rolling their muscles, especially coaches, but I really am old school. And I think that stretching, breath exercise, putting the desired activity or muscle movement pre-activity, I think is more important. And some people have dynamic stretching, some people use rollers. I just think that you can't forget stretching the joint, because there's other components to stretching that are also beautiful that help prevent injury, and in this case help prevent pain. So in the wintertime, if you're expecting a cold front to come in, or if you're expecting the arthritis joints are going to be very painful, you might want to adapt a stretching activity for the winter. Every morning, if you get out of bed, before you go brush your teeth, just do some stretching routines. Whatever joint is the most irritating, it might get you to the point where you at least loosen the muscle. If you loosen the muscle, less pressure for the rest of the day, for the rest of the winter, but you have to do it on a regular basis. So that's the first thing, tight muscle. Second possibility of pain or aching from a joint would be synovial fluid thickening. So that's this stuff. This is supposed to be an orange. That hyaluronic acid, or that slippery, viscous fluid that's kept in the synovium that bathes one cartilage surface onto another cartilage surface and keeps it slippery. Think of this, like a drop of water between two glass panes. If you have two glass panes together, I don't know if you've ever done that before, and there's no fluid, it's going to be hard. You're going to have that surface very hard to move on itself. If you drop water or oil between the two glass panes, it moves, very slippery. Think of your shoes on tile that's a little bit wet. You'll have less adhesion because it's slippery. The rubber or plastic on your shoe is a layer of water between it and the tile, slippery tile, and you'll just glide across it. Versus dry sneakers on, say, a basketball court, you'd rather have the friction in the dry sneaker to have better control. So if the synovial fluid in here becomes thickened, it might not allow for its properties of viscosity. Those of you who change your own oils, the oil has a viscosity rating to it. In the wintertime, you want something that will tolerate and not freeze, but you also want it so that when it does heat up, it's slippery. So if you put in winter viscosity oil into your car during the summer, you're going to cause more work for that engine. Not good. If you put summer viscosity oil into your winter engine, it might freeze up. So I'm probably getting too outside the realm of medicine, but I'm a car guy. So thicker viscosity usually means that you're going to have to warm this joint up. So thick versus thin, usually if you have thickened viscosity, it will cause a sense of friction, and you'll have to move the joint. You'll have this sensation that, oh boy, there's not that much fluid in there, when in actuality there is fluid, but it's just a little bit thicker. That's the theory. Again, all this stuff hasn't been proven because there's no, well, thus far, but these are my attempts at answering the questions, and all my treatments here are very conservative. So how would you take care of the synovial thickness? Number one, warm foods. So having cold water in the morning, probably not a good idea. You can have it on hot days if you're in the midst of summer, but you always want to warm up or start your day with warm fluids. That's an old Ayurvedic tradition anyway. So warm fluids, less inflammatory foods for wintertime. So inflammatory foods, I'll get to that in a second. I have an old Ayurvedic book, and it does list certain foods you should avoid for abnormalities. I'll just leave it at that. But the most obvious would be if you're a big milk, if you like to indulge in milk, ice cream, yogurt. Wintertime, I wouldn't do that. I would probably switch over to non-dairy, just because dairy seems to slow down things. It builds up mucus. It thickens fluids. So I would stay away from those inflammation foods and beverages that you would be able to tolerate in the summer. You're not going to be able to tolerate in the winter. Sometimes anti-inflammatory prescriptions or herbs would be helpful too. Prescriptions, Motrin, Mobic, Relifen, Etodolac, or just a baby aspirin and Advil might help. It's an anti-inflammatory, but they cause a lot of problems with the kidneys and livers. Maybe once in a while is okay. If you're a chronic pain sufferer, you probably have a prescription for it. Get on top of that for winter. Herbs, I think turmeric is very good. I think ginkgo, which I have over here, I'll talk about that in a second, is very good. Glucosamine sulfate seems to increase more range of motion and staying well hydrated. So I also, and I stated that already, so I would try to avoid alcohol, coffee, caffeine, any diuretics. Coke is a diuretic because of its caffeine. Alcohol is a diuretic, well, just because alcohol makes you pee. And same thing with the coffee bean. Sometimes you'll find caffeine in black tea leaves more so than green tea leaves. I like green, so I stick with that. But try to keep up with your fluid intake. Push more than usual. Be very diligent in the wintertime to avoid a dehydrated state or semi-dehydrated state. The only problem is peeing all night. You're not going to like that. So also, you might want to try to deal with or take in off-season foods. In the local grocery here, they can ship in stuff from 2,000 miles away, so you can still have greens when in actuality Chicago, most greens are stopping, most farms are finished, and then we're going to be indulging in pumpkin and seeds, in a lot of different foods than summertime. Now in Ayurveda, which is a yogic tradition of healing, oh by the way, that there is my SAD light, which I'll talk about in a second. Seasonal affective disorder is thwarted when you have a light like that shining 30 minutes in the morning. So I try to do it. I have a history of depression, but I try to just invest because my daughter got it for me, and it's not a big deal. I keep it off to the side. So if you have seasonal affective disorder, you might want to start addressing that now. So this is a book called Eat, Taste, Heal. I got this when I was doing my yoga teacher training at the Chopra Center. And Ayurveda is a different type of medicine, but it's older than the medicine you and I are used to. Allopathic medicine in the United States or in a civilized world is about 200 to 300 years old. Ayurvedic medicine, traditional Chinese medicine, about 2,500 years old. Now back then they didn't have CT scanners or blood tests, but they did have food and wisdom. So not sure, but here's something called kapha. Kapha is a biopsychosocial type. That's there's 3 types. You don't have to learn about that. I don't want to confuse you, but certain types of foods inflame kapha. So I'm just going to show you. Kapha is usually worsened in the wintertime. Or I should say, the same things that a kapha patient will follow will be what you want to follow in the wintertime. So I don't know if you can catch that, but these are some of the things to avoid. This says avoid ice cream, cow milk, sour cream, whey, yogurt, Maybe indulge in chicken, eggs, fish, shrimp, turkey. Avoid pasta, Brazil nuts, cashews. So down here is the things to avoid. Over here are the things to take advantage of. Sorry about that. Avoid, take advantage. This is just listing. So it's not that you have to be kapha, but that dosha type, it's called DOSHA, that dosha type, it would be what I would follow for an average arthritic patient in the wintertime. So look it up, probably on the Chopra Center. However, so those things are the things you want to avoid. So you want to avoid diuretics, alcohol, coffee, caffeine. You want to try to avoid this typical foods that slow you down that are heavy. And unfortunately, they're usually going to be heavy for wintertime because if you actually eat the food of the season that's around you, it's good for average Joe because of the energy source. It's very energy dense. But if you have arthritis, you might want to avoid that. So just for a short time. And then once you get accustomed to the winter, then you can get back to the local foods. So my last idea for what causes joint pain is low barometric pressure. Low barometric pressure, or low pressure front, as the weatherman would coin, is almost the same thing as altitude sickness. So when I'm just going to I'll put a link to a video I did on trying to avoid altitude sickness herbally. But usually with low barometric pressure, I'm going to treat the pains that you get like when I'm on top of 14,000 feet or higher. I haven't been higher than that yet, but I will be by the time I turn 60 in 3 years. However, there are some aches and pains that occur when you ascend too quickly. So I'll treat this like I would with my sports medicine or altitude sickness patients. How do you avoid that? Number one, you push fluids, especially with your ascent really quickly, especially if you're not trained. Like I tried to push. I did make it to 14,000 feet this last August, but I suffered. I didn't train. I just did a last minute hike for my 57th birthday, but I made it. However, I pushed as much as I could fluids. Then it caused me, I had to carry the fluids up the mountain, which was a lot of extra work, but it just worked out perfectly. Also, obviously, changing latitude would be important. If you constantly have problems, then being a snowbird and going down to Florida or going down to the equatorial states or countries during the wintertime probably a good idea. I think if you do that intermittently with a couple of vacations, that would be good too. I think it resets the body's circadian temp, and I think it will make you get through the wintertime with less need for prescription medicines and suffering. Also, training pre-season would be important. That's cardiovascular training. If you can prepare for cold season, your joints will fare better off if you have, just like my altitude sickness avoiders, if you have trained pre-season. If you're cardiovascularly fit, you'll have more blood flow, faster blood flow, better viscosity. I think it'd just be better to tolerate the changes if you're an arthritic sufferer. There is something called the stage descent. When my patients are trying to train for altitude, I'll see a couple of, in Chicago we're flatlands, and there's no way I can train cardiovascularly to attack a mountain, but as far as the change in fluidity of the blood, the flow of blood vessels and the blood itself, the only thing that will help me train for attacking 14,000 feet is to actually be at 14,000 feet, and that means intermittent training down in Colorado, which I'll try to do this spring and summer before the next attempt. However, training down here with the masks that I see some people use in exercise, or the snorkels, it just causes resistance. It doesn't really cause the same effect, but it's better than nothing, I guess. If you wanted to train perhaps for altitude, and or maybe to avoid, in my theory, maybe to avoid the low barometric pressure issues of winter, you can buy a tent where you mimic high or low pressures of a high mountain or high altitude, and you'll have to sleep in it. But that's really hard to get and expensive. I just wanted to throw that out there for my athletes or my climbers for wintertime. So also treating the root cause is really important. So taking care of gout, tidying it up before wintertime, taking care of your rheumatoid arthritis, tidying that up before wintertime, Sometimes if you can decrease your weight, that'd be all awesome. Working on inflexibility, also important. Deconditioned. If you're deconditioned, meaning cardiovascularly unfit, and you're walking into winter, I mean, you're going to suffer more. So try to have the threat of August, September, October, and turning cold and dark has the reminder, oh, I got to start training again. Mood is also important. So if you have seasonal affective disorder and you go into the season with just an achy joint, this depression that occurs during SAD will make that achy joint more pronounced. Doesn't really do anything with the joint, but you have less tolerance for pain. So taking care of seasonal affective disorder with something like that light, or an SSRI, if like Prozac, Zoloft, Paxil, or St. John's wort, I think would be very important. SAMe is also great. I think I've done a video on that. If I'm not mistaken, I'll put a link down below if I can find it. A ginkgo is something I use for my climbers. The ginkgo extract, I did a video on that too, and it helps with climbers, but it also helps with mood. So since I talked about seasonal affective disorder, I said ginkgo would probably be a plus minus. Number one, it's not going to hurt. You have to be careful if you're on a blood thinner already. So beetroot, my cyclists, the cycling community usually loves beetroot for its change in nitric oxide. So that too, if you've ever heard about divers' bends, it's when a diver goes down to high bottom of the ocean, high pressure, and then comes back up too fast. Sometimes you'll have nitrogen come out of solution and cause an embolism in the muscle, like mini strokes in the muscle. And beetroot sometimes will defeat that. That's why cyclists, number one, they have low blood pressure. Number two, they have this tremendous reserve when they use beetroot, supposedly. I mean, cyclists are just awesome altogether, but I don't think it would hurt. So during the winter months, ginkgo, beetroot, maybe taking care of the seasonal affective disorder like I mentioned, and hopefully that does give you a leg up on the pain of winter. Just to tell you about the barometric part, because I love this idea. So usually if this is Earth and this is a human and this is outer space, this amount of pressure on top of you, and there's water molecules in the atmosphere, there's gravitational force, but there's a lot of pressure that we're used to. If you get on top of a mountain, there's less pressure, less oxygen. Well, there's I guess the percentage of oxygen is about the same, but there's less available oxygen to breathe from, so you'll have those symptoms of high altitude sickness, which usually are shortness of breath, dizziness, body aches, joint pain, and edema. That's the same thing that a lot of people in the wintertime suffer from. Or, more applicable to us, low pressure fronts. When you have a low pressure front, you have low pressure altogether. So when you have low pressure, again, it's almost going to mimic this thing. Less pressure because of the altitude of the mountain, less pressure because of a low pressure front. It'll almost mimic. That's why I say it's important to understand the concept of altitude sickness. If you treat it, which I always do, if I treat altitude sickness or low barometric pressure, I think that you'll get 2 for 1. Number one, if you're going on top of a mountain, you'll take care of the issues of high altitude sickness. Number two, if you're not going on top of a mountain, you're just trying to deal with Chicago's achiness, then you'll have good response to that. I mean, either way, there's a couple different reasons. Unfortunately, there's not a great, light just shut off, done 30 minutes. There's a couple ways to take care of the pains and aches of wintertime. And those are 3. So hopefully it gives you a little bit of an idea. But unfortunately, there's not that much great information. Data with the NIH is limited. There's some smaller case studies here and there, but mostly the reporting is anecdotal. So I don't think with the limited information and data, I think that my 3 reasons for of how to get ready for winter, they're all healthy anyway. And it might even get you on a mountain with me. So check out my Dr. Rick hiking excursion page. Otherwise, try to get there, try to make it through the winter and stay healthy if you can. Thanks for watching. I'll see you.